common denominator you will find when reading through books or watching documentaries that covered the 50s and 60s is the use of LSD, a psychedelic drug that was one of the symbols of the hippie movement that had its roots since the late 1890s as a counterculture German youth movement. A substance seen as a miracle drug, being utilized for pharmacological research with the potential of understanding schizophrenia, or a truth serum that would force subjects to reveal all their secrets about governments and operations, or a drug capable of unlocking the humane boundaries of knowledge that would connect a man with divinity and beyond, or as a token and symbol of freedom, peace, love, and sex. A substance created in a private pharmaceutical company in Switzerland found its way to the entire world. How? And why? What was the original purpose of LSD in the first place? How many miracles did it actually manage to accomplish? And who were the people pushing it forward? In this two-part series, I'll try to answer these questions since the story of LSD is convoluted, confusing, sad, and fascinating all at the same time. When the CIA, FDA, psychiatrists, college dropouts, self-proclaimed shamans, doctors, and even the Nazis are involved, you know it's deeper than what we were told in the generic history books.
At the very beginning, especially in the United States, when it was that said that millions of Americans have taken LSD, it was very often used without the necessary care, and there were accidents and terrible things happened, and this has changed. People have learned now to use LSD, not only in the medicine, but also in the streets. And that is means that we have no more, or practically no more accidents.
Albert Hofmann is known as the father of LSD, born in Baden, Switzerland in 1906, and while the discovery of LSD is by far his most popular achievement, he had many contributions to the medical world before that. Hofmann signed with Sandoz Laboratories after graduation of chemistry in the spring of 1929. Sandoz offered him an opportunity to do research on natural ingredients. He was under the watch of Professor Arthur Stoll, at the time the director of the pharmaceutical department, and was tasked to study plant substances of recognized value like foxglove, Mediterranean squill, and ergot rye, which are characterized by their instability and uncertain dosage, leading to very little use in medicine. After his first contribution to the structure of the common nucleus of glycosides, Albert started to study ergot alkaloids under a warning of Professor Stoll about how sensitive and unstable these compounds were. Ergot is produced by a lower fungus that grows as a parasite on rye and other species of grain and wild grasses. It can be traced back to the Middle Ages, where it will cause all types of outbreaks that led to gangrenous or convulsive diseases. Its effects went from convulsions, muscle spasms, vomiting, and hallucinations, and it is even attributed to the death of 20,000 to 50,000 people that led France to be invaded by what was going to become Germany. W. A. Jacobs and Elsie Craig from the Rockefeller Institute of New York were able to isolate and characterize the nucleus common to all ergot alkaloids in the early 30s, naming it lysergic acid, which would serve as the basis of the Hofmann research that allowed him to create multiple compounds from lysergic acid that offered other or displayed new pharmacological properties. During his initial experiments, Hofmann found an improved ergobasine that found application as a dependable uterotonic, which is a medication that causes the uterus to contract and help to treat uterine atony, induce labor, and control postpartum hemorrhage. That's how in 1938, he produced the 25th substance known as LSD-25, which stands for the following name in German. LSD-25 was synthesized in an effort to obtain a circulatory and respiratory stimulant, where initial experiments revealed restless during the narcosis for animals and a strong effect on the uterus. But interestingly enough, further research was discontinued since no special interest was found from pharmacologists or physicians at the time. Hoffman would continue to research ergot alkaloids for another 5 years, contributing to methergine, hydrogen, and the hide ergot. Strangely enough, by Hoffman's own words in his book LSD, My Problem Child, published in 1979, something about LSD-25 drew him to keep doing more testing. He felt the substance had a lot of undiscovered potential and other uses the initial research didn't reveal. One can argue how much of a coincidence it really was for Hoffman to retry LSD. But the truth is that there is no definitive evidence that states the contrary. And this case is even more interesting when you take the fact that, during those times, Sandoz had a strict ruling on research of substances that were not found to have pharmacological interest or benefit. Hoffman would execute a couple of tests with LSD-25, leading to the very famous and widely popular Foundation for the Bicycle Day. On April 19, 1943, Albert accidentally exposed his fingers to the substance, which absorbed it immediately, which showed the extreme potency the substance could have in humans. He went back to his home after the initial testing, which had to be on a bicycle since cars were heavily restricted for the ongoing World War II. On his trip back home, Hoffman would experience kaleidoscope, fantastic images that distorted reality and seemed to alter his senses. Here's a quote of Hoffman's experience. Quote, "Every exertion of my will, every attempt to put an end to the disintegration of the outer world and the dissolution of my ego seemed to be wasted effort. A demon had invaded me, had taken possession of my body, my mind, and soul. I jumped up and screamed, trying to free myself from him, but then sank down again and lay helpless on the sofa. The substance, with which I had wanted to experiment, had vanquished me. It was the demon that scornfully triumphed over my will. I was seized by the dreadful fear of going insane. I was taken to another world, another place, another time." The follow-up effects after the drug wore off were equally as impressive and confusing. He felt an enhanced perception of his surroundings. All his senses were highly sensible, and he felt as if he was experimenting a totally new world. At the time, this was a massive breakthrough, mainly because Hoffman was able to vividly recap his entire experience while in his inebriated state, meaning that the conscious recording function was not interrupted. Take into consideration that psychiatrists, psychologists, and scientists in general were looking for ways to understand and even control the brain and know its inner workings. Just as a kid tells his friends about his shiny new toy, Hoffman immediately wrote to Professor Stoll and other researchers at Sandoz. This euphoric reaction to a substance that could have been used in pharmacology, neurology, and especially psychiatry blinded Hoffman about its potential risks and dangers during narcosis. Since the substance was not able to be tested in humans until it was initially experimented on animals, which needed to be approved by Sandoz to do so, the first experiments of LSD involved Professor Stoll and Professor Rutland to do self-experiments with a lower dose than what Albert used. They were surprised by its potency despite the very low dosage. This led to even more self-experiments, where volunteers of Sandoz would consume LSD in a controlled setting and dosage under strict watch of professionals. And as Hoffman states in his book, quote, "The danger of LSD lies not in its toxicity, but rather in the unpredictability of its psychic effects." Unquote. LSD will be presented to the world by Werner A. Stoll, son of Professor Arthur Stoll, who led the first systematic research of LSD on human beings after animal trials were concluded. He published his results in 1947 in the Swiss Archives of Neurology and Psychiatry under the following title. The focus was on how LSD affected both healthy subjects and schizophrenic patients, and its potential to treat mental disorders. Sandoz recognized the vast potential for medicinal and psychiatric use of LSD, which caused the company to make public all available research of it, where researchers of all over the world could request samples of LSD, named the licit at the time, and only requesting research data as a fair trade. In consequence, the world would soon learn about LSD. Reports all over the world led the CIA to know about the efforts of the Nazis, followed by the Soviet Union and the Red Chinese about interrogation techniques that would force subjects to speak the absolute truth.
The CIA was trying to learn how to control people's behavior without their knowledge. Now, this all came out in Senate and congressional hearings in the 70s. It was exposed, but nobody knew about it until 1974 when Seymour Hersh, the New York Times reporter, reported it on the front page of the paper. So their main objective was to create what they called hypno-programmed assassins, people who would kill on command, popularly known as Manchurian candidates, after a book that was written in 1962 and later became a movie and then a movie again.
The secret drug wars of the 40s had the goal to develop a truth serum to use during World War II interrogations. After the war ended though, intelligence agencies would keep the research as they saw it as a national security threat. Their goal was to develop a drug capable of forcing subjects to release all the information they had, as well as understanding all the possible options other countries could use and how to fight it back. For the CIA specifically, what started as sleep deprivation in early experiments evolved into narcohypnosis by the late 40s, where psychiatrists would attempt to induce a trance state after administering a mild sedative. Another technique was the use of barbiturates, which are medications that cause relaxation and drowsiness in conjunction with stimulants, usually some type of amphetamine. The goal was to set the subject in a trance state perfect for interrogation, which would be named the Twilight Zone. A report by the CIA covers in detail these applications and even more if you want to research further. The CIA had multiple teams running its mind control efforts, so in order to consolidate them under a single plan, Project Bluebird was created under extreme secrecy. It didn't go to the project's review committee and was directly approved by the then CIA director Roscoe Hillenkoetter. To quote a direct CIA document of Project Bluebird, quote, "The purpose of this project is to provide for the immediate establishment of interrogation teams for the operational support of OSO and OPC activities. The teams will utilize a polygraph, drugs, and hypnotism to attain the greatest results in interrogation techniques." Unquote. Bluebird activities were designed to create an exploitable alteration of personality. This meant that the use of the infamous lobotomies were not discarded, and some even pushed for it during the project's lifespan. At this point, you might be wondering what the CIA has to do with LSD. Well, Sandoz would trade LSD in return for research data, with aspirations for making progress in possible treatments for schizophrenia and other psychiatric diseases. As soon as LSD was public, a source in Switzerland would inform the CIA of such a substance, and through the FDA and other health institutes, the CIA would request samples of LSD for further testing. The involvement of the FDA is a controversial topic, as it is this entire story. One name to look up for is Dr. Harris Isbell, who was a member of the FDA's Advisory Committee on the Abuse of Depressant and Stimulant Drugs. She was one of the lead scientists in the mind control programs the CIA ran, testing on all different kinds of subjects with and without their consent. Dr. Isbell would act as one of the bridges for the CIA to obtain drug samples from European pharmaceutical companies, which were assumed to be requested by a US public health official. Allegedly, companies like Sandoz Laboratories wouldn't know of the very deep network of scientists employed by the CIA. Isbell, Pfeiffer, Cameron, West, and Hodge were some of the biggest doctors and scientists that gather intelligence for the agency.
The brainwashing that Jolly West made his bones on. In other words, Jolly West comes into the CIA's purview because he was able to deprogram, quote unquote, the POWs who had been brainwashed by the North Koreans. What I am alleging is that they were brainwashed by Jolly West, and that's how he got
to forget or to agree. Yeah.
Whatever it was, right, to recant, Eric, that they had been brainwashed into saying what they said over there.
In 1953, Sandoz decided to deal directly with the FDA, which assumed the role of distributing LSD across the United States, as well as having access to all independent researchers that were requesting samples for their own studies. This basically allowed the CIA to know exactly who was experimenting with LSD and what their discoveries were. Interestingly enough, this wasn't Sandoz's first time dealing directly with a national institution. In 2017, German author Norman Ohler published his book Tripped, Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the dawn of the psychedelic age. Oller describes the side of Nazis during the drug war and the search for the truth serum that would later mobilize the CIA. In this book, Oller points out that Professor Arthur Stoll had a direct connection to Richard Kuhn, who was Hitler's leading biochemist and main figure running mind-controlled drug programs. Oller claims that Stoll would provide information about LSD and even share some samples. His work was a predecessor to Hoffman, as well as a mentor in many ways. It is not described if he was aware of Richard Kuhn operations and how really was Stoll involved in the experiments the Nazis ran. But if I were to let my conspirational side free for a bit, it seems odd to me how Stoll would directly provide samples to Kuhn instead of doing it directly through Sandoz like many other researchers were. This leads to a lot of questions. For example, was Arthur Stoll threatened or under heavy surveillance by the Germans? Did he earn something by working with Richard? More importantly, did Stoll have contact with any other agencies? Some of these questions are in the air and might never be answered. The CIA wasn't the only one experimenting with LSD. Another actor was the US military, which was looking to develop tools for interrogation purposes against prisoners of war with the goal of extracting as much information as possible. Now, it might sound sinister, but one can make the argument that conducting experiments on your enemies to protect your own people and achieve peace is a very reasonable trade. It's very hard to accurately tell if the army knew about the CIA operations and vice versa, since in the late 40s everyone was trying to achieve the ultimate mind control drug. And if the goal was to protect national interest and the people, I would give the opinion that not many would really complain. The problem was that the army and CIA were not just testing drugs on prisoners, they were doing it on everyone. What started as scientific research with Dr. Max Ringso, who was the first person to acquire LSD in the West Hemisphere, where in 1949 he obtained a supply of LSD from Sandoz itself. He proceeded to give the drug to Dr. Robert Hyde, who was the first person in the West to take an acid trip. This was 3 years before the CIA funding. Ringso and Hyde reported their initial findings in May of 1950, highlighting that LSD causes a transitory psychotic disturbance. The research of LSD evolved from a potential treatment to schizophrenia and other mental diseases to a full mind control program. The US Army was running secret experiments on LSD, but it wasn't enough to use POWs or prisoners. The Army wanted to understand how LSD impacted people during their regular routine. They would secretly pour LSD into drinks, food, and other consumables without the people's consent, and afterwards would set observers to study the behavior of the subjects in the wilderness. Dr. Frank Olson was an army scientist who specialized in biological warfare research. Described as a gregarious family man, he returned to his home one night, quiet and uncommunicative. He slipped into depression and displayed psychotic behavior, which led him to be sent to Dr. Harold Abramson in New York. Abramson taught at Columbia University and was a lead LSD researcher for the CIA. He was in New York for therapy, and he was sure that the CIA was putting something in his coffee to make him stay awake. He would hear voices and perceived an alteration in his reality. He was visibly going insane as every day went on. All of this culminated in the distressed doctor jumping out of a window during his stay in New York. Olson's widow was giving a government pension, but wouldn't really know the truth until decades later. It turns out the CIA was secretly adding LSD into Olson's drinks, which caused his erratic behavior. It is unknown how many times the agency did this to him, but it was enough to alter his entire personality and lead him to end it all. Still to this day, though, some reports claim that Olson was thrown out of the window, while others claim he jumped by himself. The Olson case is covered by Albert Hoffman in his book, and this is where he points out that LSD, up to that point, was never associated by direct brain damage or organic malfunction, nor to any overdose reactions that would lead to death. Hoffman states that LSD needed to be experimented on healthy individuals that did not have any psychiatric preconditions. The subjects needed to be informed on the experience they were going to embark on. The dosage was heavily controlled, and a doctor was always present during the trials to guarantee the subject's safety. None of these procedures were followed by the US Army or the CIA. Their goal of studying LSD in the wild had no boundaries, not even their own people's safety and the nation overall. The death of Olson led the CIA to cover up any evidence regarding their use of LSD across the entire staff and unwilling subjects. But it didn't stop their projects. We now know that LSD made its way to the United States, and really the entire world through Sandoz laboratories. The goal was to expand their research of LSD to find potential treatments in the psychiatric area. Any researcher, independent or member of an institute, was capable of requesting samples of LSD in exchange of research data. But how was a drug meant for research made its way to public consumption? And the symbol of an entire movement? How far did the programs of the CIA and the military go in order to find that truth serum?